What was fascinating about, I mean, the point, to buttress this point, when you took the major issues of the Occupy movement, they were a majoritarian movement. When you look back on the Occupy movement, what do you think its failings were, its importance were?
Well, I think it's a little misleading to call it a movement. Occupy was a tactic, in fact, a brilliant tactic. I mean, if I'd been asked a couple months earlier whether they should take over, public places, I'd have said it's crazy. But it worked extremely well, and it lit a spark, which went all over the place. Hundreds of places in the country there were Occupy events. It was all over the world. I gave talks in Sydney, Australia, to the Occupy movement there. But it was a tactic, very effective tactic. Changed public discourse, not policy. It brought issues to the forefront. I think my own feeling is its most important contribution was just to break through the atomization of the society. It's a very atomized society. There's all sorts of efforts to separate people from one another, as if the ideal social unit is, you and your TV.
Hannah Arendt raises atomization as one of the key components of totalitarianism.
Exactly. And the Occupy actions broke that down for a large part of the population. People could recognize that we can get together and do things for ourselves, that we can have a common kitchen, we can have a place for public discourse, that we can form our ideas and do something. Now, if those attitudes, that's an important attack on the core of the means by which the public is controlled. So you're not just an individual trying to maximize your consumption, but there are other concerns in life, and you can do something about them. If those attitudes can be, and associations and bonds can be sustained and move in other directions, that'll be important. But going back to Occupy, it's a tactic. Tactics have a kind of a half-life. You can't keep doing them. And certainly you can't keep occupying public places for very long. And it was very successful. But it was not in itself a movement. The question is, what happens to the people who are involved in it? Do they go on and develop? Do they move into communities, pick up community issues? Do they organize let's take, say, this business of, say, worker-owned industry. Right here in Massachusetts, not far from here, there was something similar. One of the multinationals decided to close down a fairly profitable small plant which was producing aerospace equipment, high-skilled workers and so on. But it wasn't profitable enough, so they were going to close it down. The union wanted to buy it. Company refused, usual class reasons, I think. If the Occupy efforts had been available at the time, they could have provided the public support for it. This happened when Obama virtually nationalized the auto industry. There were choices. The one choice was what he took, of course, was to rescue it, return it to essentially the same owners, different faces, but the same class basis, and send them back to doing what they had been doing in the past, producing automobiles. There were other choices. And if something like the Occupy movement had been around and sufficient, could have driven the government into other choices, like, for example, turning the auto plants over to the working class and have them produce what the country needs. Right now, for example, the Steelworkers Union is trying to establish some kind of relations with Mondragon, the huge worker-owned conglomerate in the Basque Country in Spain, which is very successful, in fact, and very includes industry, manufacturing, banks, hospitals, living quarters. It's very broad. If that, it's not impossible that that can be brought here. and it's potentially radical. It's creating the basis for quite a different society. And I think with things like, say, Occupy, the timing wasn't quite right. But if the timing had been a little better, and this goes on all the time, so it's always possible, it could have provided a kind of an impetus to move significant parts of the socioeconomic system in a different direction. And once those things begin to take off, and people can see the advantages of them, can become quite significant. There are kind of islands like that around the country. So take Chattanooga, Tennessee. It happens to have a publicly organized internet system. It's by far the best in the country. Rapid internet access for broad parts of the population. I suspect the roots of it probably go back to the TVA and the New Deal initiatives. Well, that can, if that can spread throughout the country, why not? It's very efficient, very cheap, works very well. It could undermine the telecommunications industry and its oligopoly, which would be very good.